distinguished guests on dais, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. Whilst they put the presentation on, it's coming partially right now. It's an opportune moment to talk about this issue. Globally, and this was stressed in a couple of addresses earlier, electronics is bound to play perhaps the defining role when selecting platforms and developing aerospace defense industry globally. In India too, electronics is the defining factor for platform selection for growth of this industry. We will come to some of those numbers later on, but as we will find out, over the next 12 to 15 years, we're looking at almost $53, $54 billion of defense electronics, which will be at a subcomponent level. We're also looking at anywhere between 18 to $20 billion of large system programs which will encompass electronics, IT, communication, and in which electronics will play a substantial part, maybe to the tune of 30, 35, 40%. We're looking at a cumulative opportunity of around $60 billion of equipment which will have to be put into place in India in this segment. You were very right, Doctor, when you were talking about the fact that the design part is the defining feature, and we will touch upon that in the report. It's also in the detailed set of recommendations that have been talked about and in the recommendations which are being made forward. But as we move forward to the presentation, we will maybe spend a minute on who we are. Can we move forward to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. As a firm, we have been in operation for some time now. We've done almost 50 years. We are globally considered to be one of the leaders in this business. Aerospace defense is a key practice for us. We work with almost everybody of repute across the world in this segment. In India, we're possibly the largest consultancy for aerospace defense today. These are some of the clients who we work with in India. Some of the names you will recognize. Some of the names are new and are global players. Now, in terms of global defense market itself, it's important to put the case of electronics in a construct. The market itself is now expanding, but kind of stabilizing as well. The market was led by US till recently, but the big expansion is now coming in Asia. Even in Asia, the reasonably large piece of defense electronics play will happen in India. To be very realistic, and if you look at some of the numbers which are presented here, by 2020, of the substantial market of $130 odd billion worth of defense electronics procurement, 5% of that will have to happen from India, which we're talking of an annual market of around $8 billion of electronics procurement. If we look at programs specifically, and electronics can be looked at from two lenses. You can have large systems which are totally driven by electronics, projects like TCS, projects like BMS, which have been talked about with industry largely across public domain. And they can be platform-based electronics which sits on aircraft, which sits on ships, which sits on land systems. If you take platform electronics alone, in the next 10 years, and this could be slightly aggressive, but in realistic terms, accounting for delays as well, in the next 10 to 12 years, India will need almost $52 billion of platform electronics. Now that's a very, very substantial number. Obviously, a lot of it will be met through imports. A lot of it should be met through domestic production as well. In terms of large system projects, which are electronics projects and network projects, etc., where electronics forms 30, 35, 40% of the components, and which are all pervading. So network projects like tactical communication systems, which will form the backbone of Indian Army, where electronics per se would be 40% of the program in total. We're looking at $18 billion of these programs which will come through in the next 10 years. So you're looking at a cumulative opportunity of around $70 billion. Give and take the electronics component out of it, hardcore electronics component, you're looking at $60 billion. $60 billion is a very, very substantial opportunity, especially now linking it back to the $400 billion of electronics imports which India will incur overall basis. So you're talking about almost 20 to 25% of that overall market will come from this one segment alone. What are the challenges? And we've tried to keep the slides brief. The details are in the paper which is presented there. There are two types of challenges. There are challenges which only Indian industry faces, and there are challenges which are congruent to the global industry as well. Let's talk about the global industry challenges. The first big global industry challenge is product life cycles are shortening. A lot of you use iPhones. Do you even recall which was the year the iPhone was introduced in? It is a very, very recent phenomenon. It's not even a 6-year-old phenomenon. Telephone cycles have dropped down to a year, year and a half, 2 years. That's the model cycle you're talking about. It's the same for electronics. Every generation of electronics, the time cycle of that is compressing substantially. Because of that, R&D costs are going sky high. Today, firms cannot operate and say, listen, we will produce all sorts of electronics across the spectrum. The R&D costs are prohibitive. They don't allow you to do that. Firms are tending to specialize, focus, localize on 1 or 2 or 3 particular segments. This is the reality which Indian firms will also have to face. This is the reality which DPSUs are facing currently. So Bell will have to focus on a certain set of electronics that it wants to grow and build in. Private Indian industry will have to focus on which are the segments it wants to focus and be in. The second big issue is across the value chain, there is extremely high levels of risk-sharing partnerships which are being developed. So when we were talking about Foxconn, and to enter into the supply chain of Foxconn is extremely difficult. To enter into the supply chain of a Raytheon, a Northrop, is extremely difficult. To enter into the supply chain of Thales is extremely difficult. Nobody changes their risk-sharing partners. And I think at a policy level, from an MOD perspective, when we would be drafting offset policies or localization policies, this is one aspect we would have to be careful about. See, the fact is, we believe we have large order quantities. Let's take an example. Let's take a new example of FICV. We believe Land Systems $10 billion is a large order quantity. The US ran a program called the JLTV, Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, which is a small armored vehicle. The program cost is $60 billion. Our large programs are minuscule or small as compared to globally relevant program sizes. And if we expect global OEMs to change their entire supply chain for our small value programs or small quantity programs, that could be asking too much. They will do it, but then the costs will have to be borne by the Indian MOD.